Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you something that will touch your spirit, something that will ignite a fire in your heart today. You've been through a lot, haven't you? The road has been tough and it hasn't been easy. But I need you to hear me loud and clear today. Your promise is still on the way. You may not see it yet, but it's coming. It's coming. And I'm here to tell you, it's time to claim it. We've all been there, facing the uncertainty of what the future holds, wondering if we'll ever get what was promised to us. But the word of the Lord says that God is not a man that he should lie. And if he said it, he will do it. He's faithful. He's faithful even when we can't trace his hand. Even when we can't see how it's all going to work out. He's still faithful. You've been in the waiting room long enough, and now it's time to step into your season. You see, there's a difference between wishing and claiming. There's a difference between hoping for something and stepping up to receive it. God has already made promises to you, promises of peace, promises of joy, promises of success, promises of healing, promises of breakthrough. And I'm here to tell you, it's time to claim that promise. You've waited long enough. Some of you have been praying for things for years, wondering if they'll ever come to pass. You've tried and you've tried again, and you've faced disappointment after disappointment. Maybe you've been questioning whether God remembers your prayers, whether he remembers the tears that you've shed. But I want to remind you today, my brother, my sister, God hasn't forgotten you. He hasn't forgotten his promises to you. Now, I know that sometimes when we talk about promises, we want things to happen instantly. We want to wake up one morning and find that everything is in place. We want the healing to come overnight, the breakthrough to be immediate, the financial freedom to arrive tomorrow. But that's not always how it works. Sometimes you have to fight for the promise. Think about the children of Israel. They were given a promise, but before they could claim it, they had to go through a process. There were obstacles, there were enemies, there were mountains to climb. But through it all, God was with them. And he's with you too. Sometimes the very challenges you face are setting you up for the very thing you've been praying for. Sometimes the fight is not just about your strength, it's about your faith. Do you have the faith to believe that your promise is still alive? Do you have the faith to step out in obedience, even when it looks like nothing is happening? You see, claiming a promise requires action. It requires you to step out of your comfort zone. It requires you to move when everything in you says, stay still. It requires you to get uncomfortable, to trust God even when you can't see the next step. That's why I'm here to remind you today the promise is already on its way. But you've got to claim it. You've got to take it by faith. There's a story in the Bible that perfectly illustrates this. There was a woman who had been suffering from a condition for 12 years. She spent all her money on doctors, but no one could heal her. She heard that Jesus was passing through, and she thought to herself, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I will be made whole. She didn't wait for someone to pray over her. She didn't wait for someone to call her out. She took action. She reached out, and as soon as she touched his garment, the Bible says she was healed. I wonder if there's somebody out there who's willing to reach out today, who's willing to take action. Maybe you've been sitting by the sidelines for too long, hoping that one day things would change, wishing that the promise would come. But it's time to stop wishing and start claiming. You've got to reach out and take what's yours. What are you waiting for? The promise is in your reach, but you've got to claim it. You see, claiming a promise isn't passive, it's active. It's bold. It's saying, I know that God has something for me and I'm going to take it. It's saying, I've been through the fire, but I'm still standing. I've been through the storm, but I'm still here. And if God said it, I believe it, it's mine. But I need you to understand something else. When you claim a promise, you've got to be ready for what's coming. You've got to be prepared for what God is about to do. Sometimes we want the blessing, but we're not prepared for the responsibility that comes with it. We want the promise, but we haven't built the capacity to receive it. You've been asking God for more, but can he trust you with more? Can he trust you with the blessing you've been praying for? When God opens the door, will you walk through it with integrity? When the promise comes, will you still give him the glory? You see, claiming the promise is not just about receiving what you've asked for. It's about being ready to handle it. That's why some of you have been waiting. It's not because God is slow. It's because he's preparing you. He's working on your character. He's building your faith. He's making sure that when the promise comes, you won't squander it, you won't mess it up, and you won't forget who gave it to you. I hear some of you asking, well, how do I know when it's time to claim the promise? Let me tell you, there's a moment when the Spirit of God moves in your heart and you just know. It's like when Abraham heard God's voice saying, get up and go to the land I will show you. He didn't know all the details, but he trusted God and obeyed, and that obedience led him straight into the fulfillment of the promise. Some of you have been waiting for the details. You've been waiting for the roadmap. You've been waiting for all the answers. And I'm here to tell you, you may never get all the answers. But God is calling you to take a step of faith. You don't need all the answers. You need obedience. You need faith. You need trust. It's time to claim your promise. But don't think it's going to be easy. Don't think it's going to be without opposition. Oh no, there will be obstacles. There will be naysayers. There will be critics who tell you it's impossible. There will be circumstances that make you wonder if you heard God right. But I'm here to tell you, don't back down. The enemy doesn't attack what's not valuable. If you're facing opposition, it's because what you're about to receive is worth the fight. Keep pressing, keep believing, keep moving forward. Well, there is a 12-step. I want you to understand that the moment you step out in faith and claim the promise, something shifts in the spirit realm. I know you can't see it yet, but things are already starting to align. God is already moving on your behalf. You are in a divine moment. Don't miss it. You've been waiting for your breakthrough. You've been praying for your healing. You've been hoping for a miracle in your marriage, in your finances, in your children. And I'm telling you right now, claim it. It's already yours. The promise has your name on it. But you've got to lay hold of it. You've got to step out of your comfort zone. You've got to walk by faith. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait until everything is lined up. Don't wait until the fear is gone. Claim the promise right now. In the midst of your uncertainty, in the midst of your doubt, in the midst of your struggle, the promise is still on its way and it's waiting for you to claim it. Step into your season. It's time, my friend. Claim it, believe it, and take possession of what belongs to you. God is faithful and he will see his word come to pass in your life. Step out of the shadows of fear and step into the light of the promise. It's yours. No matter how long you've waited or how difficult the journey has been, God's promises are still alive and on their way. Trust in his faithfulness. You can't just hope for or wish for your promise to come true. You must actively step out in faith, take action, and claim what is rightfully yours. Before receiving the promise, it's important to build your faith, character, and integrity. God is preparing you to handle the blessing responsibly. The road to claiming your promise won't be easy. There will be challenges and opposition, but stay strong, press forward, and remember that the fight is worth the reward. I know some of you have been waiting for a long time. You've prayed, you've hoped, you've believed, and yet it seems like nothing has changed. The days turn into weeks, the weeks into months, and sometimes it feels like the years are slipping by with nothing to show for it. And I want to tell you this, the promise is still on the way. The promise is still on the way. You may not see it, but that doesn't mean it's not coming. You may not feel it, but that doesn't mean it's not on its way to you. Sometimes, just because you can't see it in front of you doesn't mean it's not being prepared for you. God's timing is not your timing. We live in a world where everything is instant. Instant food, instant messages, instant gratification. And sometimes we get caught up in thinking that God operates on the same timetable. But his ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. God doesn't rush the process. When he gives a promise, he doesn't just hand it to us. He prepares us to handle it. And sometimes the preparation takes time. I understand the pain of waiting. I know it's hard to keep going when you can't see the finish line, but I want you to hear me clearly. You are not forgotten. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen. Some of you might be thinking, it's been too long. I've waited too long. Maybe it wasn't meant for me. And I'm here to tell you, that's a lie from the enemy. The enemy wants you to believe that your promise is lost, that your prayers are unheard, that your dream is too big. But I need you to rise up and declare, my promise is still on the way. There is something powerful about God's timing. In the waiting, He is doing something in you. He is building your character, strengthening your faith, and preparing you for what's about to come. Think about the story of Joseph. He was given a promise, a dream, that one day he would rise to a position of great authority. But what followed that dream was years of hardship, betrayal by his brothers, being sold into slavery, being falsely accused, and spending time in prison. There were many moments when Joseph could have given up. He could have allowed his circumstances to dictate his faith. But he didn't. He held on to the promise, even when everything around him screamed that it wasn't going to happen. Joseph didn't understand why he had to go through what he went through. But looking back, after he was elevated to the position God had promised him, he could see that every single part of his journey had been necessary. Every painful moment, every betrayal, every prison cell had been part of the process that led him to the fulfillment of the promise. And I believe that for many of you today, you are in the midst of your own process. You are being refined, you are being shaped, and you are being prepared for what is coming next. I know it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel when you're stuck in the middle of the darkness. But understand this, the promise is not delayed, it is being perfectly timed. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's never going to happen. God doesn't forget what He has spoken over your life. He hasn't forgotten your prayers. He hasn't forgotten your tears. The promise is still on its way. It's easy to get discouraged when we don't see progress. We want results right now. But remember, the promise often requires perseverance. It requires patience. It requires you to continue walking by faith even when you can't see the end. I know it's hard to keep going when you feel like you're stuck in a holding pattern, but there's something powerful about pressing. I want you to hear something deep in your spirit today. Claiming a promise requires action. Too many of us sit and wait, hoping that things will change, while we do nothing. We wait for the perfect moment, the perfect opportunity, and the perfect circumstances. But what we fail to understand is that there is no perfect moment in the way that we think. The moment is now. You must take action in order to claim what is already yours. When God gives you a promise, it's not just a wishful thought, it's a call to action. Too often, we think that promises just drop into our laps without us having to do anything. But that's not how it works. God speaks over your life, He gives you His word, and then He requires you to move. You've got to do your part. Think about the story of the woman with the issue of blood. She had been suffering for 12 long years. 12 years of seeing doctors, 12 years of spending money, 12 years of hoping. And yet she was still sick. She had tried everything, and nothing had worked. But one day she heard that Jesus was passing through, and something stirred inside her. She didn't sit back and wait for healing to come to her. She didn't wait for Jesus to come to her house, knock on her door, and perform a miracle in her living room. No, she took action. She pressed through the crowd, reached out, and touched the hem of His garment. In that moment, she didn't just hope to be healed. She claimed it, she acted on her faith, and when she did, the healing flowed. There is something powerful about taking action. Faith without works is dead. You can believe all day long that God has something for you, but if you're not willing to step out, if you're not willing to move, you're not giving God the opportunity to move in your life. The promise requires action on your part. Faith moves. Faith steps. Faith takes what God has already made available to you. If you think about it, it's always been that way. When the Israelites were crossing the Jordan River to enter the promised land, the river didn't just part on its own. God told Joshua to have the priests step into the river first. The moment their feet touched the water, that's when the waters parted. The miracle happened when they moved. God said, I haven't moved the mountain even for this spot because I wanted to serve as witness to this decision. promised when I came into the land. If they had stayed on the shore, waiting for God to part the waters without any action on their part, they would have stayed stuck on the other side. You see, claiming the promise isn't just about receiving, it's about positioning yourself. You have to be in the right place, at the right time, doing the right thing. God has already made provision for you, but you have to take the steps to walk into it. If you want to see the fulfillment of God's promises in your life, you have to take some action. You have to be willing to get up and move, even when you don't know exactly how things will work out. Too many times, we find ourselves waiting for everything to line up perfectly before we act. We wait for all the stars to align. We wait for the perfect conditions, and we wait for all our doubts to disappear. But here's the truth, you will never have perfect conditions. Faith is not about waiting for everything to be perfect. Faith is about moving even when you don't have all the answers, even when the conditions don't seem ideal. You have to act on what God has promised you, even when it doesn't make sense. Think about David and Goliath. David was just a young shepherd boy, and Goliath was a giant of a warrior. The entire army of Israel was paralyzed with fear. But David didn't wait for the situation to change. He didn't wait for God to miraculously remove Goliath from the battlefield. David took action. He stepped forward, picked up 5 smooth stones, and went out to face the giant. He didn't wait for the perfect moment to strike. He acted in faith, and when he did, God moved. The giant fell. But it all began with David's action. It's the same with us. God has given you promises, and it's time for you to act on them. I know some of you are waiting for a sign, waiting for confirmation, waiting for everything to make sense before you take that first step. Sometimes we want the promise so badly that we overlook the work required to receive it. We think about the blessing, the breakthrough, the healing, the success, but we don't always consider what it takes to handle it. It's easy to focus on the end result, but I'm here to tell you that you must be prepared for the promise before you can truly walk in it. If God is going to give you what you've been praying for, He has to make sure you're ready to steward it, to handle it with wisdom, and to carry it with integrity. Preparation isn't just about waiting, it's about becoming who you need to be to receive what God has in store for you. God's promises are not just about the destination. They're also about the journey. The journey shapes you. The journey prepares you for the weight of the promise. If you aren't ready for what's coming, the promise could be more than you can handle. You see, God's blessings are not just handed out indiscriminately, they come with purpose. And you must be prepared to fulfill that purpose. Think about the story of David and Goliath. David was anointed to be king at a young age, but before he ever sat on the throne, he had to go through a process. He wasn't just handed the position of king. He had to go through years of preparation. He fought lions and bears in the wilderness. He spent time in solitude, learning how to trust God when no one else was around. It wasn't just the victory over Goliath that made David king. It was everything that led up to that moment. Look, the years of preparation built the character, faith, and wisdom that he needed to rule well. David's preparation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process of becoming who God needed him to be. And it wasn't always easy. There were times when he was overlooked, when his family didn't believe in him, when he had to face incredible opposition, but every step was necessary. God was working in David's life, preparing him for what was ahead. And when the time came for David to step into the promise, he was ready. He had the character and strength to handle it. This is where many of us miss it. We're so focused on getting the promise that we forget about the preparation that's necessary. God has a purpose for your life, but He can't always give you the promise immediately. Sometimes He needs to prepare you first. You might not understand it right now, but every experience, every trial, every setback, every moment of waiting, when you step out in faith to claim the promises of God, you are going to face opposition. It's not a matter of if you will face obstacles, it's a matter of when you will face them. The moment you decide to move forward, the enemy will begin to push back. Because what you are stepping into is not just a simple promise. It's a fulfillment of God's will for your life, and the enemy does not want you to experience that victory. But hear me when I say this. Opposition is a sign that you're on the right track. The enemy doesn't waste time fighting against what isn't a threat. If you're facing obstacles, it's because what's ahead of you is powerful. It's worth the fight. Understand that every promise God has made to you will be contested. It's easy to believe that God's promises should come without any struggles. That once God gives a promise, it should come with ease and no resistance. But that's not the reality. The road to the promise is not always a smooth one. In fact, sometimes it's the very obstacles and opposition that refine you, that strengthen you, and that prepare you to handle the blessing that's coming your way. You can't run from the opposition. You have to face it head on with the assurance that God is with you every step of the way. The first thing to understand about overcoming obstacles is that opposition does not mean you're doing something wrong. It's actually a sign that you're doing something right. In the story of the Israelites, when they were led out of Egypt, they were given a promise of a land flowing with milk and honey, a land of blessing and abundance. But before they could claim that promise, they had to face the Red Sea, the wilderness, and the walls of Jericho. There were battles, there were moments of doubt, and there were times when it seemed like all hope was lost, but God had already promised them victory. The opposition they faced was a sign that they were on their way to something great. And the same is true for you. When you face opposition, don't think that God has abandoned you. It's a sign that your breakthrough is on the horizon. The second thing to understand is that opposition doesn't define your outcome. It's your response that determines the result. How you respond in the face of adversity is what matters most. It's easy to throw in the towel when things get tough. It's easy to get discouraged when you face obstacles that seem insurmountable. But I want to challenge you today to shift your perspective. Don't let the opposition stop you. Let it strengthen you. The Bible tells us that we are more than conquerors through Christ who loves us. That means no matter what opposition you face, you have the victory. But you have to fight with the confidence that God is fighting for you. Look at Nehemiah. He was given the task of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And as he began the work, he faced tremendous opposition. His enemies mocked him, tried to intimidate him, and even attempted to stop the work by force. But Nehemiah didn't back down. He didn't get discouraged. He didn't give up. Instead, he prayed, he stayed focused, and he continued to do the work God had called him to do. He understood that opposition was part of the journey, and he wasn't going to let it distract him from the promise. In the end, Nehemiah and the people of Israel completed the wall despite all the obstacles. Your opposition doesn't determine your outcome unless you allow it to. Another key to overcoming obstacles is recognizing that your strength comes from God, not from your own abilities. We are not equipped to handle life's battles on our own, but when we rely on God's strength, we tap into a power that is far greater than anything we could do on our own. The Apostle Paul understood this when he said, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." In the midst of the struggles and opposition, remember that you are not alone. God has promised that he will never leave you or forsake you. His strength is made perfect in your weakness. When you feel like you can't go any further, lean on him. Trust that he will provide what you need to overcome every obstacle. There will be times when the opposition feels overwhelming, when the road seems too hard, when the walls seem too high. In those moments, you have to remember that you don't have to fight alone. God has already gone before you, preparing the way. In the book of Isaiah, God promises to fight on behalf of his people. He says, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper." The weapons will form, they will come against you, but they will not prosper. The opposition may be fierce, but it cannot defeat you. God is on your side. When the enemy tries to discourage you, remind yourself that you serve a God who has already won the battle. It's also important to recognize that not all opposition is physical. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought in the mind. The enemy loves to attack your thoughts, to make you question whether the promise will ever come to pass, to make you doubt God's goodness and his plan for your life. But you cannot let those thoughts control you. The Bible tells us to take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. Don't let your thoughts determine your reality. Instead, use the word of God to combat the lies of the enemy. When you feel doubt creeping in, declare God's promises over your life. Speak his truth out loud. Declare that you are more than a conqueror, that you are the head and not the tail, that you are blessed and highly favored. The mind is a powerful battlefield. If the enemy can control your thoughts, he can control your actions. But if you fill your mind with the word of God, if you renew your mind daily, you will be able to stand strong against the opposition. It doesn't matter what the world says, what your circumstances say, or what the enemy whispers in your ear. God's word is the final authority, and his word says that you are victorious, that no weapon formed against you will succeed, and that you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. Sometimes the opposition comes in the form of people. People who don't understand your calling, people who doubt your vision, people who criticize you and try to stop you from moving forward. But don't let the opinions of others stop you. People didn't understand Jesus' mission when he was on earth. They mocked him, rejected him, and even tried to kill him. But he didn't let that stop him from fulfilling his purpose. You can't let people's opinions define you or your destiny. The only voice you need to listen to is God's. And if he has called you to something, he will equip you to finish it no matter what others say. The final key to overcoming obstacles and opposition is persistence. It's easy to give up when things don't go as planned, when the road gets hard, when you face setbacks. But persistence is key to victory. Don't give up. Keep going, keep fighting, keep believing. Your breakthrough may be closer than you think. Sometimes all it takes is one more step, one more prayer, one more act of faith. Keep your eyes on the prize and don't let anything distract you. There will be moments when you feel like throwing in the towel, when you wonder if it's worth it. But I want to remind you, your promise is worth the fight. Every obstacle you overcome, every challenge you face, every battle you fight brings you one step closer to the fulfillment of God's promises in your life. Keep going. Don't give up. The promise is still on the way, and you are stronger than you think.